This is Claudia here from Metaldays 2017. This time it's with Lina Khatib. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here.
So we've met before on Wacken, and now we're meeting here at the Metaldays. So for those who don't know you, what connects you to the metal scene?
I'm a very old metalhead. I've been in the metal scene for more than 2 decades.
Right.
Since my days growing up in Lebanon and setting up a metal band and then moving on to work in radio with a metal show on Lebanese radio and then moving in time to the present, working with metal bands from the region, the Middle East. It's a long story.
Yeah. You have quite a lot to tell. So when you started out working in radio, and what was the scene like? Did it change in time? Also the political stuff going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started in the metal scene in the mid-90s in Lebanon, where I originally come from. And back then, the government didn't like metal very much.
Okay,
which means that you couldn't even buy metal tapes or CDs. Yeah. And sometimes I had to smuggle them into the country across the border from Syria, because Lebanon banned metal officially.
Yeah.
And at the same time, some metalheads were thrown in jail just for being metalheads. Right. And yet, crazily enough, I still managed to have a radio show in 1996 and 1997 on national public radio.
How did you do that?
Exactly, because the government was so ignorant that they didn't know that music that I was playing was the same music that is metal that they had banned. Imagine.
Oh, wow. So they didn't really care a lot for what they were saying themselves.
They just didn't know what they were banning.
This is difficult.
So it was crazy. Now it's not like that anymore. Yeah. It's much better, but it was a crazy time.
Yeah. So when you were with bands and when you're touring together with them, when you're taking care of all the management that has to be done, how do you go about? Like, how do you find people to talk with and all that you have to do?
Well, actually, I started from practically zero in Europe. I mean, in Lebanon, as I said, it's a long history. But in Europe, it was a case of realizing that a lot of people didn't know anything about bands from the Middle East, or they knew very little, or they didn't care very much. And so it was a case of talking literally on an individual basis to anyone who cared to listen, to say to them, by the way, there are interesting bands that come from the Middle East. They don't have the same means that bands in Europe do, but they have something interesting to say. And all of us from this region have been through a lot of hell. And so that's kind of got interest going in these bands, and it grew from there.
Okay. So now when you're talking about bands that you're working with, is there anything we can share by now, or is there a lot of secret going on?
Well, by the time anybody sees this conversation, who knows where we will all be. But at the moment, I mean, I'm working with bands that come originally from Lebanon or from Egypt. And I see myself as someone who's British Lebanese, living in London, as being a bridge between these bands from the region and the scene in Europe. And trying to say, despite all the problems in the world, despite the borders, despite the politics, we have something in common and we can connect.
Right. So for you, it's more important what we share than what divides us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think metal is a global community, and bands certainly in the Middle East don't just want to play to a Middle Eastern audience.
Yeah.
Almost all of them would love to share their music with an international audience. Of course, the internet has helped out a lot, but there's nothing like a live performance, and interacting with people. And a lot of them would love to be here, for example, at Metaldays. Yeah. Not necessarily just to perform, but even just to be here attending and getting this atmosphere that you would never get, sadly, in this day and age in the Middle East because of lack of capacity and all the restrictions.
Yeah. So if these bands are trying to bring forward their music, producing is not a topic where they live?
Well, if you're a metal musician in the Middle East, generally you will find it difficult to find a venue that would allow you to perform.
Okay.
You would not find any label locally that would want to release your music.
Okay.
Television stations will not want to air anything to do with metal. People might still accuse you of being a Satan worshipper or something.
Oh.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And you will not find supporters and investors because, they say this is a niche market that's not very important, so you won't
Right.
find many sponsors. And yet bands exist despite all these things.
Oh, yeah.
I could go on. I mean,
Yeah.
not many studios to record or rehearse, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And bands still do it anyway. And
Yeah.
that's why they look to Europe, because all these things are just taken for granted here in Europe, So, yeah, there's a big imbalance.
And now, with your idea of what culture or what music scene looks like in the Middle East, looks like here, what is your idea of what's an artist, or what defines an artist, or who defines who's an artist?
I think artists define themselves. Artists are the ones who set the agenda. Artists are people who are expressing the same things that perhaps someone, even me, who in my other life I work in politics, express things in a very one-dimensional way, in politics. It's mainly through analysis, through writing, through speaking in a very particular one-dimensional way. So the artists add layers of dimension and meaning. You are speaking and expressing yourself in 3D all the time as an artist, whereas politics is very one-dimensional. So this is how I see art. I see art as being a superior mode of expressing feelings and positions in the world than any other form of expression.
And what do you say to the problem that there's like the stigma, like you said, you might worship Satan or whatever the idea is, or that people seem rude or not very bright or, not very nice to people who don't know about metal. So what is it that you think the people in metal really express? Not saying, okay, this Satan is important to us, or not saying we appreciate violence, but what do you think they want to convey in general?
I think metal is about defying what is not acceptable in society. It's about defying violence. It's about defying discrimination. The spirit of metal is that, because, as I said, it's a global community.
Right.
However, the outside world sometimes takes the expressions of violence or the expressions of anger as being an endorsement.
Right.
And I think most metal musicians at heart want to defy the things that are bad in this world as opposed to the other way around. But at the same time, metal suffers from a stigma that people think that it's a low form of art and therefore not worthy of engagement with.
Right.
And this is something that I definitely, as me, try to fight against, because I'm someone who, in my other life, work in politics in a very kind of high-profile job in which I deal with governments and policymakers from around the world. And in general, the expectation is that someone like me, meaning who works in that domain, surely cannot be involved in something as low as metal. And so when people in that domain, for example, find out that I actually work with bands in the metal scene, they are shocked. And I like that, because I'm trying to bring them in and say, stop being so biased. Metal is just as legitimate as any other form of artistic expression. And it is all about defiance and about having very often music that is committed and not just for entertainment.
Right. Thank you very much for the interview, and please go on with all that you do. Thank you.
Thank you.